So, welcome to everyone. It's the morning of July 4th in America. This is our Independence Day, and it's evening in India. And I think we're all very aware and concerned about our relationship with China. And I thought it would be so useful to hear about the work of Devdip Ganguli and Richard Hartz. Richard has presented at our OMS previously, coming to Menla when we were basically reviewing this America's spiritual destiny, the Native American Frank Lloyd Wright, the work of Nakashima, and also Emerson and Thoreau. And he got to meet our good friend Richard Geldard and made some nice contacts. And then Devdeep, I've had the privilege of meeting in the ashram, and delighted at his friendship with Eric and Oroville, and their getting out into the countryside on their bicycles, but also his teaching in the Sri Aurobindo International Center of Education. And so these institutions, the California Institute of Integral Studies, the Gnostic Center, the work that we're trying to do here at Madhugiri of presenting and being aware of Sri Aurobindo and Mother's contribution to world thought and how that interfaces with other cultures and other philosophers, work that Debashish Banerjee and Robert McDermott are doing. And we're so pleased to have two ashramites join us. And I'll turn our morning over to Devdip Ganguli and Richard Hartz.
Yeah, so good morning. Very happy to be here and share this time with you. So I grew up at the Ashram School, and it's nice to see Prapanna. Prapanna taught me for a couple of years. Uh, so I thought the best way of presenting the work and sort of our discovery of Chinese culture and civilization was to speak of it in the way that it happened over the years. Instead of presenting it academically, we felt it would be best to share our personal sort of journey of discovery. Growing up, I have to be honest and say that China did not form any significant part of our history course. We hardly learned anything about the country, which is surprising considering we share an enormous border and we are neighbors. But for some reason, we hardly covered Chinese history or culture. Most of what we did of China was usually restricted to the events that took place after independence, a little bit about the invasion of Tibet, and then the 1962 war, which was fought between India and China. And I would say that mostly it was ignorance that defined this relationship for me growing up. But it was there were instances when something was touched. For example, I remember coming across a diary which was published in the ashram, which Jayantilal Parekh of the archives had put together. It was a diary of Hushu's paintings. So Hushu, we're going to talk about Hushu or Shu Fancheng, as he's known in China, shortly. So he had a number of paintings that are in the ashram, and there was a diary of his paintings, and I found them exceedingly beautiful. And then a little later, when I was 17 or 18, we had a French teacher, a Canadian lady called Louise, and I was doing French with her in my final year of school, and she uh, read a text in the class which was Wu Wei, and Wu Wei is a text written by Henri Borel, who is a Dutch writer who was living in China for a certain number of years. And it's a text which sort of explores Lao Tzu's philosophy and presents it in a certain way. What was special about Wu Wei is that the mother read the text in her classes in the playground, and she spoke about it in a few of her conversations, which are available. And so that also moved me quite a bit, and I felt that there was something very deep in this civilization and in this history. But other than that, it was mostly ignorance. And so it was much later, when I was 24 or 25, when a young Chinese man came to the ashram, and he had read the Life Divine in Chinese, translated by Hushu. And we developed a very good friendship, and I was very curious about him, about his life, and then through that, about his country and about his civilization. And so one thing moved to the next, and that became a kind of door of discovery for me. And so in 2009, I had the occasion to travel with Chen Shubo, my friend Chen Shubo, uh, and his to-be wife later on, Sissa. So the three of us, we traveled from the north of China right to the south, all the way from Beijing, Tianjin to Hong Kong, Shenzhen, which is at the south. And that was an amazing discovery for me, to travel through the country and to learn about the culture and so on. But the most interesting experience in that trip was meeting an elderly gentleman uh, who was who had put together the collected works of Hushu in China and published them. And this person we met in Beijing in Hushu's apartment. Hushu had passed away in 2001. So we met him in Hushu's apartment. And it so happened, coincidentally, we had, without any planning, it was on the eve of Hushu's birthday, his centenary. And that struck me as quite remarkable, that we were here in Hushu's apartment in Beijing on the eve of his centenary, completely by chance. And I felt that this was something that I had to explore and know more about. And so that's how, when I got back to India, uh, I also got in touch with other friends in Oroville who were also interested in Hushu, like Eric and Michael Kai and Amanda, who was Taiwanese and who was there in Oroville at the time. And then we started exploring and doing a little bit of research about this gentleman who lived in India for so many years. And we also put up an exhibition in 2010 of his paintings. So what I would do now is to tell you in brief about Hushu's life and his work, and then I'll pass it on to Richard, and he can tell you a little bit more about some of the projects that we are doing and some of the work that we are involved with. So this gentleman, maybe I can share the screen so that it would be easier. Julian, can the screen be seen? Richard, can you see the screen?
Yes, born Hushu.
Okay, there, great. Yeah, so it's a bit confusing if you're not used to Chinese names, and also there are different ways of spelling Chinese names. But anyway, so I'm using the system that they use in China today. So Shu Hu, or Hu Shu, is how we knew him in the ashram. Huhsu, and that's the spelling that he used, and the mother used to write to him. So he was born in 1909, and he was born in Changsha. Purely coincidentally, Mao Zedong was his geography teacher in school for a few years, but apart from that, they had no connection or contact. Um, his real influence was from another very important Chinese literary figure, Lu Xun. And Lu Xun was sort of the father of modern Chinese novel writing and fiction, an extremely influential thinker who passed away in the 1930s. So Hushu was strongly influenced by Lu Xun, and um, he after his early education in China, Hushu went to Germany, where he studied German. He studied European thought and civilization. And when he came back to China, he translated Nietzsche. That was his first translation from German to Chinese. And uh, Lu Xun also, we believe, influenced him to look towards Indian texts as well. And so, long story short, when Lu Xun passed away, eventually in 1945, Hushu comes to India, to Shantiniketan. Why to Shantiniketan? So Shantiniketan is the sort of the institution which was set up by Tagore in Bengal. And it was a place where there was this whole Pan-Asian movement which was taking place. And there was another Chinese gentleman who was called Tan Yun Shan, and Tan Yun Shan had set up the study for Chinese culture in Shantiniketan. And also a very interesting person because he came to Pondicherry even before Hushu did. Tan Yun Shan came to Pondicherry and had Sri Aurobindo's darshan, I believe in 1930, in 19 yeah 1939, and he spoke. So this is what Tan Yun Shan says after his visit to the ashram in 1939. He's the director of the China Bhavan, or the Center for Chinese Studies. I'm not sure what it's called in English. China Bhavan in Vishwa Bharati, which is in Bengal. He says, as in the past, China was spiritually conquered by a great Indian, referring, of course, to the Buddha. So in the future, too, she would be conquered by another great Indian, Sri Aurobindo the Mahayogi, who is the bringer of that light which will chase away the darkness that envelops the world today. Of course, the word conquered in a figurative sense. And he was obviously very moved by his visit to Pondicherry. So we believe that it is through him that Hushu, who was in Shantiniketan, hears about Sri Aurobindo and comes to Pondicherry in 1951. So in 1951, he reaches here, he meets the mother, and we have a poem from his early days which has been translated, and it gives an indication of how deeply he was moved by his visit to Pondicherry when he first came here. So he says, besides offering a flower to the mother, nothing else matters living in South India. Flower blossom, flower beautiful, flower be divine. The divine itself silent, and the flower itself spring. Time flies, experience beyond the material is new, timeless divine knowledge is ever fresh. This flower, this leaf, the essence of the present moment, this is the way to realization. And so once he came to Pondicherry, and the mother gave him a beautiful bungalow to stay, which is on the beach road, right next to the nursing home. It's a large bungalow with a beautiful garden, and he was the sole resident of that space. And in that building, two things happened. One, he was of course painting on the side, but his primary focus was translation. Shortly after coming here, he began translating the major writings of Sri Aurobindo into Chinese. This is very interesting because he was here at a time when those translations could not have been published in China. So this is in the 1950s and 60s when the translation is happening. And what is even more interesting is that the mother takes a special interest in Hushu, and she arranges a printing press, Chinese printing press, to be shipped from Hong Kong to Pondicherry. And she asks Nandalal Patel, for those of you who may know him, Anjana Ben's father. So the mother asks Nandalal Patel, who was in Hong Kong at the time, who was doing business in Hong Kong, to uh, purchase a printer and to look for someone who would be an assistant to Hushu for the printing work, to set the printing blocks and do the printing work. And she organized everything, including the finance for it. And Nandalal Patel, we have an interview with him, which is very interesting before he passed away. And he says that he put an ad in the newspaper asking for assistants who would be willing to go to Pondicherry and live in Pondicherry. And he got 17 applications. He sent all the photographs to the mother. The mother selected one. And this another young man from Hong Kong, Kautam Singh, came to Pondicherry for 3 or 4 years, and he lived in that big house in the bungalow, helping Hushu as his assistant. And so we have this really interesting uh, thing happening where the major works of Sri Aurobindo are being translated. They are being printed, copies are being printed, but there's nobody to read them or nowhere really to sell those books. Uh, of course, later on, a bulk of them went to Singapore, and then eventually they went back to China. But while this was happening for a good 15 or 20 years, it was a very focused, intense work. As you can imagine, Hushu didn't even have anyone to discuss his translations with. There were no other Chinese in Pondicherry at the time, or at least in the ashram for sure. Um, but there was the other aspect of Hushu, which was very interesting, which is his paintings. So he has left nearly 300 paintings, which are kept in the ashram studio, and uh, so that's a photograph of him in the bungalow when he's um, writing. Couple more photographs again. This is at the playground, and you can see here behind, not the person behind, but the one behind him. That's very likely to be his assistant from Hong Kong. So I've spoken to a few people who were uh, visiting Hushu at the time, and they generally fall into two categories: either really young children who used to go and play in the garden, or slightly older people who used to go and play Go with him, yeah, the Chinese game of Go, and or sometimes meet him. He was not a very social person, in the sense you don't see lots of photographs of Hushu in the life of the ashram, but you certainly hear about him from others who would visit him. There are some very interesting stories. We don't have the time to go into them, but the picture that emerges is of a person who was really focused on his work, extremely concentrated, and who took it upon himself as a mission to translate as much of Sri Aurobindo's writings as he could, and the mothers as well. I should also mention that he was also translating Sanskrit texts such as the Bhagavad Gita, 50 of the Upanishads, some passages from the Veda. So he was a remarkable scholar who had mastery over all these different languages. In 19, yeah, these are some of the books that he printed in Pondicherry, some pictures of them. These are many of the major works: Life Divine, Synthesis of Yoga, Human Cycle. So in 1967, there's an exhibition that takes place, and the mother gives a beautiful message for the exhibition. And I can't think of too many other people whom she referred to as a yogi. So here are the paintings of a scholar who is at once an artist and a yogi, exhibited with my blessings. And we have some photographs of the exhibition. So this is at the inauguration, and we see Nolinida and Andreda uh, coming to on the first day. Oh, I didn't mention the date is very interesting. So 4, 5, 6, 7, and the exhibition ran for 4 days. So for the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th of May, 1967. Here
I'm
you have
going
him again
to.
in front of.
Oh, 1 second, Devdeep.
Yes.
There's Scott hit his presenting button. Scott, if you'll just click the button on the bottom again, that we also have a turn on captions button, so we can turn that off and turn off the presenting button. And if you need to leave and come back again, that's fine too. Just 1 second. Let me.
Yeah.
So if Devdeep, you will start presenting again, we'll be able to go back to your. If you
Okay.
hit the present button on the bottom.
Got it. Has it come on the screen, Richard? Yeah. Okay,
Yes,
great. So
you're back.
that's a photograph of Hushu at his exhibition in 1967 in front of a painting of the mother that he made. And again a painting of Sri Aurobindo. They had a beautiful he had they had a Hushu had such a strong sense of gratitude and feeling for the mother. Each of his books he of course dedicates to her, and even in some of the conversations with people who knew him, what emerges is that he was, he felt always looked after and taken care of, down to the most material level, because he had no resources in Pondicherry, and the mother took care of everything uh, for him. And yeah, so some of his, I just 3 or 4 of his paintings to give you a feel of his style. Yeah. Yeah, that's him when he's old back in Beijing. So I'll stop sharing the screen now, but I still have, uh, yeah. So one story which I've heard Roy had recounted, which I find very interesting, is in 1973 on the 17th of November, the evening when the mother leaves her body. uh, Roy and Hushu were playing Go in Hushu's house. And in the middle of the game, Hushu stands up, and it's 7:25, which is when the mother passed away. And without knowing, I mean, without any outer way of knowing really, Hushu stands up in the middle of the game and says, "It would have been good if she had lived to be 100." And he stopped the game. Uh, and that's something which I found really remarkable. In 1978, when things improved in China and a new sort of era began, Hushu left Pondicherry. He left the ashram. He took all the books that, I mean, as many of the books that he could, and he shipped many of them back. He had help from some people also, and he went back to China. Back in China, he had two classmates, colleagues, former colleagues of his who were teaching in an institute in Beijing. And so he went and joined them. And he lived till the end of his life. When he passed away in 2001, uh, very much, very quietly to himself, mostly continuing his translation work, writing essays on Confucianism, on Taoism. And he had a small group of people who were, he didn't formally teach classes, but there were many who went to him to learn about Indian culture, to learn about his life in India. And he certainly had an influence, because we have met some of these students of his, and they are all, so many of them, deeply moved by his personality. So there's a strong imprint of Hushu on these persons. So this was my sort of discovery of this remarkable person, and we did a few things. So we did the exhibition in 2010 with Eric and Michael and Pala and Amanda at the Pavilion of Tibetan Culture in Oroville. And in 2011 onwards, this is just 4 or 5 years after his collected works were published in China. So within 4 or 5 years, we saw a lot of people visiting, doing research on him, coming from China. We had also some Chinese settling down in Oroville. We had a Chinese settling in the ashram, became an ashramite. And so there was this story which sort of started unfolding as a result of this person's very interesting work. Now, before I proceed about the work that we are some of the things projects that we are working on, I think this is a good place for Richard to come in and maybe speak about your experience and your uh, inputs. Yeah.
Can't hear.
You just need to
Sorry, Richard is
unmute
having some
Richard.
trouble with his mic, so just 1 minute.
It's just the unmuting, which is controlled at the bottom left.
So Richard will just go out and join again. Um, so
Now I hear you. No, I'm hearing you through Dev.
Okay, is it working now?
Very good.
yes.
Okay, fine. Okay, I'll take up from where Devdip left off. And similarly, I'll talk first a bit about how I got involved with China, which is even more recently than Devdip, I knew equally little about China, if not even less than what Devdip described in his case, until about 10 years ago. And in fact, yeah, it was 2011, now that I think of it, that I first met one of the Chinese visitors to the ashram, and I got intrigued by this visitor at that point. She happens to be a person that I'll show a picture of later on, because she was one of the most important people, in fact, for the purpose of our trip, which I'm going to show some pictures of for the purpose of our work of making Sri Aurobindo's writings more available in China. But to go back, first of all, another person that Devdip mentioned, who became a member of the ashram, became our Chinese teacher. And in 2012, she offered to teach a few people Chinese. And although I had no interest in China or Chinese, I was intrigued because the language always looked so impossible to me. I couldn't understand how it was possible even to read this language. And I've always liked challenges, and especially things that really seem impossible. And so I took up that challenge and started learning Chinese. And so I did that I really got quite fascinated with it, because it was not just a different language, but it was a whole different way of thinking about things. And so this went on. Meanwhile, at the same time, I was in the later stages of writing my book, The Clasp of Civilizations, which was my answer to Samuel Huntington's famous or infamous book, The Clash of Civilizations. So I presented one of his villains in his story was in fact China, that the rise of China was likely to be a major cause of a world of conflict in the world. And so I presented a different idea, that the differences between cultures are not something that we should feel threatened by, but that in fact, the hope of the future lies in these, in the diversity and the fact that other civilizations have alternatives to offer to the Western model. But at the time, not knowing much about China, it was only at the late stage when I wrote the introduction to the book that I introduced something about China, which I was becoming more and more interested in. And in fact, on the very first page, I gave a quotation from Wang Yangming, whom I'm going to be talking about a little bit later on, that I had just stumbled upon and found very inspiring. And then I started my introduction by talking about Xuanzang, the 7th century Buddhist pilgrim who came from China to India, and his 17-year epic journey was one of the great events in the history of the interactions between India and China. And then I also talked about Hushu, who is often compared to Xuanzang as a sort of 20th century Chinese pilgrim who came and spent many years in India and went back to China and translated important texts of Indian spirituality into Chinese. So I did introduce those things in the book sort of as an afterthought, but I felt when the book came out in 2015 that my relative neglect of China was a real defect of the book, because among the world civilizations, obviously China is one of the most important. And because I was studying Chinese, it was gradually drawing me more and more into the culture, and I was feeling more and more affinity for it. I became, interested, first of all, my study of languages has always been mostly literary. I was not, at this point, I had no idea that I would ever go to China. I learned spoken Chinese to some extent, but my real interest was in reading, and I was interested in Chinese poetry and Chinese philosophy. And so eventually I have ended up learning, at this point, my reading knowledge of Chinese. I saw that there was a question in the chat box. This is Mandarin Chinese that I'm talking about, the standard Chinese spoken in mainland China. That's what I mean by Chinese. Most Chinese refer to it not as Mandarin, but simply as Chinese. And so in any case, I made started to make discoveries, some of which I don't think anybody has noticed before, because as a Sanskritist, first of all, and second of all, as a scholar of Sri Aurobindo, I had a different perspective on China, and I noticed parallels both between Sanskrit literature and Chinese literature, which were quite intriguing. I won't talk about those right now, but I just have written something, as a matter of fact, on that subject of classical Sanskrit and Chinese poetry. But what I was more interested in was the philosophy. And eventually I began to study Chinese philosophy, not very systematically, and I'm still not an expert on the subject, but I was drawn into studying certain key figures, not only in the classical Chinese philosophy, but also modern 20th century thinkers. And so I'll be talking about one of those in particular a little bit. At this point, I think maybe I can start presenting, sharing my screen. And so I'll start not with our trip itself, but an event which occurred in Pondicherry about a year and a half before Devdip and I and our Chinese teacher went to China in October and November 2019. This event, this symposium and exhibition in memory of the scholar and artist Hu Hsu, Fancheng is the name by which he's known in China, took place in March 2018. The keynote address, as I've highlighted on the left, was given by the ambassador of China to India at that time, Wu Jiahui, who had been a student of Hushu. And in fact, he not only came to Pondicherry for this symposium, but he was really, I believe, the driving force behind it. He insisted on having this commemoration of Hushu at this time before he was replaced by another ambassador. Devdip was very much involved in organizing this. At this time, this was actually the first time that I spoke publicly about China myself. Devdip began the talks, and I gave the last one on India, China, and the resurgence of Asia. Now, and at this point, I started looking more into what Sri Aurobindo had said about China and really started thinking about it more seriously. So my involvement with China starts to become more serious at this point. And at this point, we also start thinking about taking a trip to China. And so the next major development was that we decided on a date for our trip. We began organizing it, and we applied to the Foundation for World Education for funding for the trip. This is the title page of my grant report that I prepared when we came back from China in November 2019. The date is quite significant because, as you can see, if we had planned our trip just a little bit later, it would not have happened. by February, it was impossible to travel to China 2020. So our visit was very felicitously timed. And so we went to China. I arrived a little bit before Devdip, and I first went to Dali, which is in Yunnan province in the southwest of China, an extremely beautiful city between this huge lake, it's called a sea in Chinese, and behind are mountains. And what's interesting about Dali, one interesting thing about it is that at the symposium a year and a half earlier, it was announced that Pondicherry in India and Dali in China were going to be sister cities. Now, I don't know what that means exactly, and nothing really has come of it, but somehow for reasons that have nothing to do with the sister city relationship, here I found myself in Dali. And when I came back to India, shortly after I returned, I was visiting Auroville, and in the Unity Pavilion, I happened to see a big, beautiful coffee table book of aerial photographs of Dali. And I couldn't even find out what the book was doing there and what the connection was with Dali, but somehow there seems to be some mysterious connection with this beautiful location in the southwest of China. So here we go. Now we really come down to business when we arrive in Shenzhen University, because the main purpose of our trip was to work on publishing Sri Aurobindo's works in Chinese, making them more available. They're already available in a certain form, but in order to read Hushu's translations of Sri Aurobindo, you have to get the complete works of Hushu in 16 volumes, which contain also his translations of Nietzsche and other writings and so on. And his translations of Sri Aurobindo are buried in that. A few other publications have started to come out, but we felt a need for a better presentation of Sri Aurobindo in China. So here we have our team. Chan Shubo, Devdip's friend, who he mentioned, is on next to me. He was extraordinary. He organized the whole trip, every detail, all of our reservations and everything, and came. And that was my reason, in fact, for going to Dali, because he now lives in Dali. And our Chinese teacher, Asana, next to Xiaoyan, next to Devdip, and Professor Zhu Xuan, who was the young woman who had visited the ashram in 2011, whom I had met, who first really kind of interested me a little bit in China. Now she's a professor at Shenzhen University, and we discussed she's a professor in the Center for Indian Studies, and here in her office we were discussing our project that we were proposing. And when we came back, after having agreed to bring out a volume of selected writings of Sri Aurobindo, which I would select, I had the job when we came back to compile this from the PDFs of the Chinese texts of Hushu's works with Sri Aurobindo's translations. So this is, just to give an idea, this is the contents in Chinese. This is now has been sent to China and is being prepared for publication. The contents in English. As you can see, I've selected about a half a dozen chapters from each of the major works that Hushu translated. The Human Cycle I put first because Chinese are especially interested in social questions. The Life Divine, 6 chapters, Synthesis of Yoga, 1 or 2 chapters from the introduction in each of the 4 parts, just 1 chapter from the essays on the Gita, then letters on yoga, and although it's mainly Sri Aurobindo's writings, that Hushu translated. Also, the mother's writings on education. We had been told by people Chinese we talked to that they're very passionately interested in education. And so this is the content of the book which is being prepared, which will be published by Shenzhen University, and we hope will make Sri Aurobindo more accessible in China. So this is was in a way the main purpose of our visit was already finished at this point once we had agreed on this. But there were many more interesting things to come. This is still at Shenzhen University. This is very interesting. This bust of Tagore is on the grounds of Shenzhen University. It's not connected with the small Center for Indian Studies as such. It's there. You can see in the background you have the skyscrapers of one of China's most modern cities. Here we're standing with students and faculty of the Center for Indian Studies, which is quite small, but this is central to the campus of Shenzhen University, and there's this bust. And what's fascinating about this bust is the inscription on the back. At the time when we saw this, my reading knowledge of Chinese was not quite good enough to make sense of this. But now that I look at it, I see that it's the first couple of lines of this are a reference to something we heard about from quite a number of people, that the Chinese talk about the three modern sages. And when they talk about the three modern sages, Shendai Sun Sheng, they're talking about Tagore, first of all, who is described here as the poet sage. Next, Gandhi, not everybody's idea of a sage exactly, but he's described as the sage hero, Shang Shong, Gandhi, and then the sage proper. There are two characters, both of which mean sage, essentially. The character for sage and one that means a wise man. This is Sri Aurobindo. So Sri Aurobindo is mentioned here in this very public location in Shenzhen University, in connection with Tagore, of course, who is better known because in China, the best known Indian in China, because modern Indian, because he went to China in 1924 and gave talks there, and he was he's well known as a Pan-Asianist. This refers to his getting the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1913. And at the bottom, it talks about how this bust was, Anandi has suggested saint philosopher. That would be a possible, because Shang itself can be translated saint. But it's true that Shang emphasizes the spirituality, the side of spirituality, and the word for the wise man has a more intellectual implication. So saint philosopher is a possible. In fact, Zhishui, the word for philosophy, uses the same character. So in any case, now we heard about this from many people. And this is the main point I want to make in this connection, that I was quite amazed in China that everywhere we went, people already knew about Sri Aurobindo. And we were meeting all kinds of people at various institutions. And if you travel around America, unless you visit Sri Aurobindo centers, you don't meet you meet very few people who have ever even heard of Sri Aurobindo.
Yes. Of course, Richard. To be noted that these were centers of learning and people who were reading quite widely.
Of course, that's true. We were meeting intellectuals and cultured people. We gave talks at an art academy, and so on. So we weren't meeting your average Chinese, but still,
Still, yes.
not only was there the name recognition, they all knew who Sri Aurobindo was, but it was very easy to talk about Sri Aurobindo because first of all you had to do was talk about Hushu. And that gave a very easy way of introducing Sri Aurobindo, whether they really knew much about Sri Aurobindo or not. You could introduce him through Hushu. But also I found that I could introduce Sri Aurobindo in connection with some of the modern Chinese philosophers that I had been studying that I'll come to in a moment. So not to take too long, this is in Beijing. Between myself and Devdip is Professor Sun Bo, who Devdip already referred to, not by name, but this is his biography. He was a colleague of, a much younger colleague, of course, of Hushu's at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, the most prestigious institute of social sciences and humanities in China. Sun Bo inherited his apartment, essentially, and he's one of the main promoters of Hushu in China, the author of this biography. So that continues. Hushu was central to our whole visit at every step in one way or another. The whole thing would not have happened in the way it did without Hushu. Nevertheless, there were quite different aspects of the visit. When we came back down south to Hangzhou, where we were going to give lectures at the China Academy of Art, we first had a short meeting with members of the Sunshine Eco Village, some of whom have been to Oroville and have a very different interest than most of the people we were meeting at more intellectual academic institutions. So just to give an idea that this is there too, this ecological interest is another thing which we didn't have time to pursue. We couldn't actually visit their eco-village during the time available, but maybe we will do so in the future. So now we come to Hangzhou. Anandi has just noted it's part of the global eco, the global global eco village network. Let's see, to avoid mirroring, I'm having a problem with my sharing the screen. Let me do it again. Okay, so Devdip and I were each asked to give a presentation at the China Academy of Art, which we did on 2 successive days. They were 3-hour presentations in the afternoon on 2 days in a row, and Devdip's was on Hushu. He began by showing this magnificent picture of Sri Aurobindo, but then this is the mother's message on Hushu for an exhibition of his paintings. Here are the paintings of a scholar who was at once an artist and a yogi, which is quite an extraordinary compliment coming from the mother. So that this, of course, was very appropriate at an art academy. But I was also asked to give a presentation, and I haven't worked especially on Hushu. So I gave a presentation the next day. This gives an idea of the audience. What is remarkable about this is it's not a huge audience, but it's quite substantial that it was 3 hours, and this picture could have been taken at just about any point during the 3 hours, because at the end of the 3 hours, the audience was pretty much what it was at the beginning. They seemed...
And these are open presentations. So it's not like a class.
Yeah,
anyone could come.
So they could have come and gone, but they didn't go. My presentation was over 2 hours, and then there was a long session of questions and answers. And the audience seemed enthralled with it. And this was about Sri Aurobindo and Mou Zongsang, a Chinese philosopher that probably most of you haven't heard of, but everybody I met in China practically had heard of and was very enthusiastic when I mentioned that I was studying Mou Zongsang. So I'll say a little bit now about Mou Zongsang, because the present work that I'm doing on presenting Sri Aurobindo in relation to bringing Sri Aurobindo into conversation with Chinese thinkers. He's one of the main ones. Wang Yangming, whom I mentioned previously, is another one. I also wanted to just mention our translator. Now, on my right is Professor Wen Zhong, who organized the thing. He's an enthusiast of Indian philosophy, has been to India a number of times, is actually a follower of Vivekananda. But the translator is a woman who had flown in from Shanghai to translate Devdip's presentation, went back to Shanghai overnight and came again to translate my talk. And I felt I could, because I knew what she was saying, I could follow. I found it a remarkable job of translation as far as I could follow what she was doing. And generally, whenever I had to speak through a translator, I was extremely impressed with their translation abilities. So this is Mou Zongsang. You can see what the name looks like. This is an autobiography that he wrote at the age of 50, which was after he had left mainland China. He was born in the same year as Hushu in 1909. He died in the 90s sometime. He left mainland China in 1949 at the time of the revolution and spent the rest of his life in Taiwan and Hong Kong. He wrote this autobiography, A Philosophical Life in 20th Century China, which is one of his few works which has been translated into English, unfortunately. His complete works come to 32 volumes, of which only 3 or 4 volumes are available in translation. And so this has been one of my motives for improving my reading knowledge of Chinese. I want to just give an example, not of his philosophy, strictly speaking. He was a remarkable philosopher. He was trained in Western and Chinese philosophy. He translated all 3 critiques of Kant into Chinese. That gives an idea of how serious a philosopher he was. But he developed his own very original philosophy based primarily on Confucianism, but also synthesizing Taoism and Buddhism, inspired to a great extent by the Neo-Confucianists several centuries earlier. The movement that he belongs to is usually called New Confucianism, as opposed to Neo-Confucianism, which goes back 1,000 years. So this New Confucianism, of which Mou Zongsang is one of the best known figures, but there are a number of others, is something which was has become well known in mainland China, in spite of the fact that it doesn't. It would seem well. He was all of the New Confucianists were strong advocates of democracy. That may not be the thing that's best known about them in mainland China, but it's certainly true. But here I want to read a little bit about his critique of the culture of the state of Chinese culture, Chinese society. During his time, he was, as I said, born in 1909, so he arrived in Beiping, is Beijing. It had just been captured by the Nationalist Army and renamed for a while as Beiping. in the spring of 1928, so he was just 19. He refers to a certain scholar who had committed suicide and says a preeminent figure in classical scholarship, Wang devoted the later part of his life to studying ancient history, etc. The next part is what I find interesting. But in his delving into our civilization's past, he never got to the core of the matter. He never did put his finger on the pulse of Chinese culture and come into contact with its true vitality, its life. Wang was also one of the first to venture into the world of Western thought, yet there too he failed to grasp its fundamental character, the spirit behind its evolution. At a time when Chinese civilization seemed caught in a struggle for survival, the Mandarin intellectual was lost, unsure of the way ahead for both his culture and his own life. So this is his Mou Zongsang's critique of the traditionalists. He also has a critique of the new culture movement, which is rather similar. It basically amounts to the superficiality of it all, that both the conservatives and the progressives were equally superficial. None of them went to the heart either of Chinese civilization or of Western civilization. And so at this point, I want to make a comparison with an essay by Sri Aurobindo, which to me has a number of resonances with what Mou Zongsang was just saying. Mou Zongsang was writing a little bit later, but referring to more or less the same period. This was published in the Arya in the second decade of the 20th century. Sri Aurobindo, just to give the main points, writes, India has to change as the whole West and the whole East are changing. The new Orient must necessarily be the result either of some balance and fusion or of some ardent struggle between progressive and conservative ideals and tendencies, or else a new spiritual awakening must arise from the depths of this vast life, etc., that shall ally itself closely with the renascent spiritual seeking of the West. This third and as yet unknown quantity is indeed the force needed throughout the East. For at present, we have only two extremes of a conservative immobility and incompetence imprisoned in the shell of past conventions, and a progressive force hardly less blind and ineffectual because secondhand and merely imitative at that time of 19th century Europe. But you still have these same forces both in India and in China, the conservatism and the progressivism, neither of them going very deep into either the ideals of the West or the ideals of the East. The result is a continual fiasco and inability to evolve anything large, powerful, sure, and vital, a drifting in the stream of circumstance, a constant grasping at details and unessentials, and failure to reach the heart of the great problems of life, which the age is bringing to our doors. Especially that last phrase corresponds quite closely to a phrase in what I read from Mou Zongsang's autobiography and elsewhere. He was quite obsessed almost with this disappointing state of China, China's inability to get to really get on its feet and recover its ancient civilization. So I'll go on with our trip, not to take too much time. I did get a chance to relax. The trip had been pretty intensive for about a week or so at this point. This is West Lake, practically across the street from the China Academy of Art, where we gave our lectures, a famous historic location. And from there, I went to an extremely interesting place, which is called the Wenli Academy in the mountains in the same province. And this is a school for teaching Chinese culture in the traditional way, teaching Chinese classics through a lot of, in fact, rote memorization and so on in the way that used to be done in both China and India. And it sounds rather uninteresting when you look at their educational program at first. But when you learn more about it, it becomes much more interesting. First of all, the woman next to me has been to Pondicherry a number of times and is very interested in Sri Aurobindo. And
she was also a sort of student of Hushu.
Yeah, that's right. Devdip knows many of these people much better than I do, in fact. In any case, and her daughter, incidentally, was one of the remarkable translators that I referred to. The next day, or a couple days later, just before I left, I talked to the younger students in the school, and my translator was May's daughter, who's I think just 13 or 14 at the time, and she translated my talk into Chinese. These now are Sanskrit students, because at Wenli Academy they teach not only Chinese in the traditional way, but they also teach Sanskrit and Latin. So it's not as conservative and parochial as it looks at first sight. There's an element of cultural nationalism in it, and that's part of the reason that the government supports these kinds of things. But there's also something much more cosmopolitan and global in the outlook represented by this institution. And a big surprise for me, this is the founder and director of Wenli Academy, Professor Wang. He's referred to Wang Yangming. He was a student of Mou Zongsang. So when we planned my visit, I had no idea that my interest in this modern Chinese philosopher was going to converge with this particular location that I was going to be visiting. Also, the fellow in the white sweater who's looking at Professor Wang was a PhD student at the University of Chicago, who was doing his doctorate. He was preparing to do his dissertation on this phenomenon of such schools in China, which is the subject of a book by a Frenchman whom this PhD student I just showed is in contact with, named Sébastien Biliou, The Sage and the People, the sage being Confucius, of course, the Confucian revival in China. And later on in the book talks about the Dujing movement. This is what this school represents, the classics reading classics, literally, movement. The so-called children classics reading movement is a phenomenon that developed massively during the 2000s and that constitutes one of the most visible dimensions of the reactivation of Confucian references within society. Several million children at least are involved, and classics reading classes are burgeoning all over the country. The movement originally developed thanks to the action of a number of well-known Confucian activists, such as Taiwanese professor and educator Wang Yangming. Now, this is our Professor Wang. The book was published in 2014 before Professor Wang had founded Wenli Academy. So that's why the Wenli Academy is not referred to. But a little bit later, it talks about him. A disciple of famous philosopher Mou Zongsang, Wang chose to dedicate his energy to the promotion of Confucian education, thus largely enabling contemporary Neo-Confucianism, another word for New Confucianism, the movement which Mou Zongsang represents. To acquire enabling this contemporary Neo-Confucianism, of which he is an heir, to acquire a new social dimension, the importance of which is only starting to be understood. So what I'm getting at here is that this movement can be very interesting, because although it looks at first like something Sri Aurobindo talks about in the Renaissance in India, when he says that there were 3 steps in the Renaissance. The first he calls the reception of the European contact, which involved a certain amount of rejection of Indian culture. But then there was the reaction against that, which tends to go back to its conservative traditionalism. But then the third possibility that Sri Aurobindo talks about is a new creation, which he said was just beginning at the time that he was writing the Renaissance in India, when he was publishing the Arya. Now, this new creation really cannot be said to have happened either in India, or what's very interesting is that China went through very similar stages under the name of Renaissance. In fact, they talk more about the Renaissance of China. The Chinese Renaissance is referred to much more in China than the Indian Renaissance is in India. In fact, when we traveled from Shenzhen to Beijing, we traveled on the Renaissance Express. But it's been understood in several different ways, and the ways in which the Chinese Renaissance have been understood correspond to all 3 of the 3 steps that Sri Aurobindo talked about. But the most interesting is the one represented by these new Confucianists, who had a similar vision of a new creation in China, which would involve a discovery of the deeper meaning of Chinese civilization, but not a reaction against and a rejection of the West, but a synthesis with Western culture. So the article, actually, which I partially presented, it was incomplete at the time, but in Hangzhou, the talk that I gave there, I've entitled the article "Rethinking Asia: Cultural Synthesis in the Philosophies of Sri Aurobindo and Mou Zongsang." This aspect of cultural synthesis is something which I think has a lot of promise for the future. And this movement of going back to Confucianism, however traditional it may be, I think was very necessary, because there was the attempt in the last century to practically destroy the connection with the ancient culture of China. So this is just to put the Wenli Academy in context. From this point, I went back to India, but on my very last day, I heard a lecture by Professor Wang in Chinese, so I couldn't understand much, but it was about Wang Yangming, whom I've mentioned. And I've been working lately on Sri Aurobindo and Wang Yangming. Wang Yangming is an extraordinary figure in the history of Chinese culture, philosophy, and spirituality, representing the Neo-Confucian period. He was the main dates of his life are easy to remember, because he was born exactly 400 years before Sri Aurobindo in 1472, and he had his enlightenment experience in 1508, which was exactly 400 years before Sri Aurobindo had his first major spiritual realization. The dynamic idealism of Wang Yangming dominated China during his lifetime and for 150 years thereafter. This is from the source book in Chinese philosophy, which was published in the 1960s by Wing-Tsit Chan. It's one of the main sources of Chinese texts, philosophical texts in English. Now, as Anandi has just mentioned in the chat, Wang Yangming is much read in China now. he's become very well known, more so than Mou Zongsang, I believe even. I had not become so interested in Wang Yangming when I was in China, so I didn't talk to people so much on that subject. But since then, I was asked last year to write a paper on Sri Aurobindo and Wang Yangming. In spite of them living 400 years apart, they're actually, the thing about Wang Yangming is Mou Zongsang was a philosopher, a remarkable philosopher, but not himself, you wouldn't refer to him as a mystic. Wang Yangming is referred to as a Neo-Confucian master, and he really did have mystical experiences. And I want to just give some idea of his writings. From this Inquiry on the Great Learning is his commentary on a very important classical Confucian text, Da Shui, the Great Learning. In my article, I've actually done a double comparison. I've compared the classical Confucianist text, the Great Learning, with the Gita, and I've compared Wang Yangming with Sri Aurobindo. Wang Yangming commented on the Great Learning, and Sri Aurobindo wrote essays on the Gita. So it made a rather complex but interesting argument. This paper was written at the request of or it was written on request for a special issue of the Beijing International Review of Education, which is an English language journal of education published in Beijing. And the special issue will be on integral education. And so they wanted the editor of this special issue, which is also supposed to become a book, wanted a comparison of Wang Yangming, who had inspired her on the Chinese side, with Sri Aurobindo, whom she had come to know. And she attended a conference on integral education at the Gnostic Center in India, near Delhi. Now, let me read just a little bit to give an idea of the quality of Wang Yangming's philosophy. The great man regards heaven and earth and the myriad things as one body. He regards the world as one family and the country as one person. As to those who make a cleavage between objects and distinguish between the self and others, they are small men. Forming one body with heaven, earth, and the myriad things is not only true of the great man, even the mind of the small man is no different, only he himself makes it small. So then the question is based on the text of the Da Shui, the Great Learning, which he's commenting on. There's a phrase that the learning of the great man consists in loving the people. This is one of the 3 attributes of the learning of the great man. Why then does the learning of the great man consist in loving the people? Answer by Wang Yangming: to manifest the clear character is to bring about the substance of the state of forming one body with heaven, earth, and the myriad things. Hence, manifesting the clear character consists in loving the people, and loving the people is the way to manifest the clear character. Everything from ruler, minister, husband, wife, and friends to mountains, rivers, spiritual beings, birds, animals, and plants should be truly loved in order to realize my humanity that forms one body with them. And then my clear character will be completely manifested, and I will really form one body with heaven, earth, and the myriad things. So this gives just some idea of the depth of the tradition, the spiritual tradition in China. Many people, of course, Taoism is well known, and the spirituality of Taoism is obvious, but it's not quite central to, although it's important in Chinese culture. Confucianism is much more mainstream and central to the definition of what is distinctive in Chinese culture. Similarly, Chinese Buddhism, it had a great influence. And in fact, Wang Yangming synthesized Confucianism with both Taoism and Buddhism, but nevertheless he took his stand primarily on Confucianism because of its concern with this world and the life of society. He felt that Taoism and Buddhism were too otherworldly for him, that they tended to draw energy away from dealing with the problems of this world. So this is pretty much what I wanted to. Why don't I turn it back? Do you want to talk, Devdip?
Yes.
Let me stop sharing here.
Yeah, you can maybe mute yourself also.
And mute myself. Let's see.
Yeah. Yes. So I just want to wrap it up, Julian, so that then we can open it to questions. But I just want to say that one of the things that I see when in engaging with China is to recognize that there are many dimensions to this relationship between India and China and the world. I mean, it's easy for us to be sort of blindsided by the existing political realities, and especially in India. I mean, we are very much aware of the challenge that China represents politically and militarily, and it's a reality for us. We've faced a difficult year last year with incidents at the border. So one should not be naive in thinking of studying any country or civilization in through a narrow prism. But precisely for that reason, I was telling Richard, we were discussing the other day, that when you look back at the long history of civilizations and cultures, and you find an engagement which has happened over centuries that is so much deeper than the immediate political realities. And I think the focus of what, at least for me, what is important is to try and keep that connection at a deeper reality alive, to keep it, to not let us forget the fact that behind whatever the existing challenges are, there is a level at which Chinese spirituality and Indian spirituality have interacted, engaged. China has learned and taken so much from India, and again, we have so many things to learn from the Chinese in certain fields as well. And I feel that through the coming decades, whichever way the immediate relationship will go, there is something deeper that has to manifest. And it is for this reason that someone like Hushu was in the ashram, and why the mother gave so much importance to him, and importance as in to, gave him the field that he needed to do his work. And I think it's important for us in the integral yoga, at least, to keep that bigger picture and not get completely lost in the immediate present.
Well,
I don't
I'm
know if Richard,
so
you would like to.
I'm so grateful for both of you to get into the details of your trip and to know more about Hushu, and I know there are a number of people who are quite interested in and expert on China. This little symbol at the bottom of raising the hand would be helpful, and it's those of you who are too shy to speak can type in the chat. So if anyone wants to raise their hand and keep a brief comment so that everyone has a chance to interact in the remaining time.
Julian, I see that Anandi is here. She's been leaving a few comments as well. Maybe if you give her a few minutes, because she's a Chinese living in Oroville, and it would be interesting to hear from her. Maybe
Yes,
if
she
she's willing
joined
to
us
say
earlier,
something.
and I asked her specifically. So please, Anandi, go ahead. Do you want to speak, Anandi?
Okay, you can hear me?
Yes, thank you.
If I may, just take about a few minutes. Thank you for organizing this, and I especially feel inspired by the name of with a friend just now before coming to this conference. We were just in front of Sri Aurobindo statue in Savitri Bhavan, Oroville. So I have been living in Oroville for 5 years, and It is like a spiritual home for me. And this world, or my hometown, home country, as a true home for many years. And now that I have found Mother Sri Aurobindo, so I feel I have come home. And also India and the whole world is also my home. So I am now speaking.
Anandi, I'm going to ask you to turn off your camera in hopes that we can hear what you have to say. So if you would turn off your camera, and we'll see if your audio is a little more clear. I know from a previous conversation that the
maybe I can go.
No, this is good. Keep going.
Okay. So I would like to speak as an Aurobilian, which oldest Aurobilians now, they say nobody has yet to become a true Aurobilian, because in Auroville, Mother has set a very high ideal for what it means to be a true Aurobilian, but we try. And we make mistakes, we go out, experiment. And I see how necessary it is. So what I wanted to emphasize is the willingness, what it means to be a volunteer, the voluntary spirit to face whatever challenges come in the way. And about this topic, interestingly, the voices that I have heard and the opinions that have been expressed are from the ashram, from India, from others concerned in the West. Maybe if I am to say from a person born in China coming to Auroville, I would say let's look at some Chinese characters that describe. For example, we use for USA, we translate the name as 美国. 美 means beauty. So the land of beauty, the land of true beauty, is the name reserved for the USA. And India, we translate as 印度. 印度 could be the land that should deliver herself and deliver the world. And China is the land of the heart. So if there is a key to unlock many mysteries, many blockages that have been interestingly and laughably existing in our personal and national relationships, I believe each of us and each of our nation can find the way through going back to its true national soul, individual soul, which can also be mirrored in the words that are of the name of these nations in Chinese. In fact, when I came to India to join Auroville, I asked my mentor. I had 3 mentors back then. 2 of them are from the US. And we have very good relationships. Now we are friends and we collaborate on many things. So I asked my other mentor, and what should I bring to when I join? I had only 1 suitcase. She said, bring whatever makes you happy. And I looked at the things that I needed to bring, I need to size down, to minimize. And so I didn't bring one, I brought 1 book. I didn't bring anything else. And I brought in my heart 1 phrase. 和而不同, which translated into English is unity in diversity. This 和而不同 has been kind of the catchphrase in Chinese thought since millennia. However, in limited ways, it has been realized, but it's there. It is very much there. And even in a place like Orville, the unity in diversity is not so much manifested as a reality, let alone a traditional and modern society like India, China, or US, each with its own beauty, strengths, and challenges. So in Oroville, I met with initially in the first few years, I met with a lot of people who call me the Chinese, talk about the Chinese, and talk about Tibet, talk about Chinese eating snakes, dogs, and talk about and when we had New Year celebrations, there I could feel in certain gatherings that I attended, there was a very palpable hostile feelings, kind of almost wanting to exclude our existence here in Oroville, which was unbelievable for me at that time. And so I spent many initial years with a hard time crying for the truth, crying to Krishna for the truth. And later on, I kind of healed myself because with a change of my heart, with a healing that goes very, because Orville brings miracles. And I believe those miracles are there when we open our hearts and minds and broaden ourselves. So a lot of the people initially who were questioning, who were seen as unexpressive beings from the East, which have faces similar to Koreans and Japanese, which they mix up. And then gradually people see me and see others as persons. It seems that's still difficult, but now it's there is a shift, and I have made some very good friends, close friends who used to have strong bias. And so at one gathering, I said, "You are very welcome to become a Chinese. If you really don't like the country for any reason, or like it, or are curious about it, you are most welcome." And in fact, to understand and untangle the puzzle of the human unity and ultimate union with the divine, I believe that for me and for each one, there is this need to broaden ourselves, to see that this national identity as one of our labels, one of our social conditionings. So for this past 1 or 2 years, thanks to the lockdown, which in Chinese we see as every crisis as intertwined danger and opportunity. So I have taken it as fully as an opportunity to grow into a vaster being, to reach out, to actually to make life in a flow, to move, to learn different things, to understand many other cultures, diversities, much beyond what we currently view in the mainstream as their superpowers in a struggle, either you or me or another. So kind of, I believe this kind of personal journey, personal channeling of the aspirations with the realities that we live in is very much necessary as human beings, because when we read Sri Aurobindo, when we quote them, when we talk about them, when we talk politely, but with the undercurrents that are going there, I believe things are not going to fundamentally change, because God has given us every possibility, every potential, and somehow we are so limiting ourselves. So these years I have met with many, many wonderful people who are themselves, I would say, children of the earth, children of the mother, not exactly identified with any nation. And I feel fully comfortable with them. I haven't grown exactly to that stage, because what is happening in the world still kind of, I still have a stream which is connected with that, which is also my curse and my opportunity to see how I can play a part in transforming this relationship. In fact, in Chinese calligraphy, the calligraphers or the painters would always use their personal stamp to stamp on the painting or the calligraphy work. I have also made a stamp, which is called lianjie. Lianjie in English, it means connection. So for me, perhaps the mission in this life, in this world, at this time, is to connect. Connect in what ways? In outer and inner ways both, to people of all lands. And I believe the world is really much, much vaster than Oroville, than India, China, US put together. And so my future effort would be to recognize that I have this background, and going forward to be not only that, and to be able to do things and talk about them, collaborate with people like Ashramites or Aurovillians or people not of the Integral Yoga circle. Not because they come from a certain background, belong to a certain community or identity, national identity, but because we fundamentally vibrate. And that is what I can recognize without words, without philosophers philosophizing, without putting labels. And then I wanted to introduce one compilation that I have collected on the words of Mother and Sri Aurobindo on Chinese wisdom. So here in the dialog box, I'm giving the link. So if any of you are interested, you can download the the ebook of what Mother and Sri Aurobindo says about China and Chinese wisdom. And in fact, I see each person, each nation has so much potential, so much strength and beauty and wisdom. And all the comparisons of blaming, labeling, and competition or rivaling is really like, at a certain level, it's a very good source for theater play or for comedy. So I believe for the future is working towards something vastly good. If we are in this dilemma right now, what is upholding us all? And what is making this conversation happen? So I would like to surrender to that and see, I always would like to see what miracles can come out of the compost.
That's a phrase that I use, the divine composter. So we are very much in synchronicity, Anandi, and resonance. Thank you
Yeah,
so much.
so that would be it. Thank you very much, and forgive me for my different voice or style or
No,
emotions.
we're very welcome. You're very welcome, and great. We're grateful for your sharing and the difficulties we all experience with the forces that try to divide us over and over again. I do see that Peter Lloyd had his hand up, and I think Scott had to leave the meeting. So, Peter, do you want to unmute? Thanks again, Anandi. And now you
Hi
need to
there.
unmute your microphone. There.
Hi. So I'm Peter. I'm an Aurobillion. I also set up the AVI office liaison in Hong Kong. And I just thought it was okay. I'll give a very brief history of the link between Hong Kong and Auroville, at least. Actually, Hong Kong has a Sri Aurobindo Center that was set up by Nimudani in the 80s, I think. So there's been a link between them, but it hasn't like had a huge popularity, not like Singapore. In 2006, I tried to move here, it didn't quite work out. And yeah, we set up an AVI office. And Nimu would host people from ashram fairly regularly in Hong Kong, but I don't know if it really took. But it was really good to hear Devdip and Richard, to hear the work that you're doing. I really appreciate this link. And I've been in touch with Anandi a month ago to see if there was some way of linking Auroville in China. So thank you everybody for this talk. Really appreciate it a lot. That's all I want.
There's one interesting thing, Peter. When Nandalal Patel was living in Hong Kong in the mid 1950s, it seems he started some kind of a Sri Aurobindo center in Hong Kong, and the mother sent a message for the center. And if my memory serves me right, the message was, "Let the eternal light dawn on the eastern horizon." And that was for, but I don't know how long that center lasted. Probably not after he came back to India, but that's all I know about that.
Could you say the name again? It just buffered when you said it.
His name was Nandalal Patel. He was a Gujarati gentleman who was living in Hong Kong and doing business at the time. And so the message that was given to the center that he started in the mid 50s was this: I can't remember whether it's actually I have it right here in front of me. So the message is, "Let the eternal light dawn on the eastern horizon." 26th June 1954.
Could you do me a favor and just put that in the chat, because I'm wanting to write a little about this. That's great. And yeah, Nim actually Champak Lal inaugurated the Hong Kong Center. This is way before I even knew anything about this. So, and stayed in Nimu's flat. So, and she was the cousin of Lakshman Ben in Auroville and another lady in the ashram whose name I forget, the kind of Sindhi side of things. So, yeah. And there's been a link there with that toehold in Hong Kong. Anyway, I just wanted to say that briefly. So thanks a lot. And
thank you.
I really appreciate the scholarship to hear about the new spirituality in China. That was really great.
Thank you.
And Hu Hsu, I would love to see his art. If there could ever be an exhibition of his art, it would be a fantastic thing to see.
Perhaps we need to have the virtual exhibition since there's so many paintings, and that's wonderful that there's a biography on Hushu. Anyone else? You can raise your hand like this also if you'd like to ask a question.
Julian, all the paintings are scanned actually. And there is a there is a proposal which is still being discussed to bring out a full catalog of his paintings, uh, maybe in association with the China Academy of Art. I don't know as yet, but it's certainly in the works.
Would you just give, as a closing remark, some mention of the Chinese ambassador to India who came down and was a student?
Yeah, I don't know too much beyond the fact that we had a visit from the Chinese ambassador to Pondicherry, to the ashram, and to Auroville also. And at that time, we didn't know anything about his connection with Hushu. But when he came to the ashram, he specifically asked to see the paintings. And that was very surprising because not many people, not even many Chinese, know that Hushu painted and the paintings are there here. And when he was seeing the paintings, and then he said that he knew Hushu when he was a student in Beijing. As a young student, he had met him and had used to go to him, and he was his teacher. And he was really moved by seeing the paintings. And soon after that, he got in touch again to say that he very much wanted to have an exhibition of some of Hushu's paintings and some kind of a conference for which he would himself come down. And that happened in 2018, in 2018 March. And there was definitely a moment when all this was happening that it felt like uh, there was, I mean, I'm sure something happened at some level, but it felt really like there was a very positive movement even in the press. The kind of, in each of his, almost all of his public speeches, he always used to refer to Hushu and the fact that he lived in India and the connection with Sri Aurobindo and all of that. So there was a moment of great hope and possibility. uh, we've had, there have been challenges after that at the political level, but I think that there is some, I'm hopeful at least that there is some deeper work which continues at another level, uh, waiting for its time and waiting for the right moment to manifest.
We thank you so much, Devdeep and Richard. Thank you for your time and your scholarship and your dedication. Tong, you wish to say something? Please. And then we'll end.
Thank you, Julian. The line is very broken. I'm not sure. When I listened to you, Julian, line was broken. When I'm speaking now, can you hear me well? It's not broken. It just feel okay. Okay, great. So thank you, Devdeep and Richard, and to see you here, and also Anandi's great work. I read your compilation. I'm based in Amsterdam. I'm Chinese too. But pity I haven't met you when I was in Auroville, visiting Auroville. I want to say wonderful work you were doing, and I also want to mention that there's a stream of group of type of Chinese who has studied in the West, who has dived deep into Taoism, and now are very interested in also Sri Aurobindo's work, especially in their daily practices. They were often of them, they are organizational consultants, they are coaches, they are coming from also some of diamond approach, some Sufi approach. It's quite interesting. I have been in different groups of conversing with them and noticing how immediately they ordered 16 volumes of books Sri Aurobindo they were reading and they were asking questions. So it's quite dynamic. And those who are also having Buddhist backgrounds, some Chinese who practiced long Buddhist path and now feeling that they are ready for explore Sri Aurobindo. And so if you want to have connection with them, I can connect you. They are more from organizational transformation and organization development work. I mean that field, not academic, but very practitioner, but also around business and management field.
Sure, Tong.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you all for joining us. At 2 p.m. Eastern, we're reading from George van Breckham's biography of the mother. And then at 5 p.m., we have Don Salmon. And tomorrow, I hope you can join us because we've invited Amita Mehra from the Gnostic Center and her team. That will be at 9:30. We have Awareness Through the Body at 8. And then Gopika from Oroville and Natica will end our conference. So thank you so much for participating, Devdip and Richard, and we look forward to seeing you again. And thank all of you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting us, Julian.
Yeah, thanks. This was a great idea.
Just wonderful. Thank you so much.